The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A new report has provided insight into what went wrong with two alternative approval processes that have been abandoned in Nanaimo since last fall. It also makes recommendations to the city on what to do if it decides to run a third AAP on the same issue. The report and the alternative approval process were on the agenda for a Wednesday Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. We're going to dive into it on today's show, but first, here's some background. There are certain things local governments in BC aren't allowed to do without first asking for permission from the voters. These include long-term capital borrowing and extending municipal boundaries. The Alternative Approval Process, or AAP for short, is one tool municipal governments are allowed to use to get approval from the voters. It gives voters who are opposed to a project a window of time, at least 30 days, to submit a form stating their opposition. If more than 10% of eligible voters submit that form, the city doesn't get approval for a project and would need to hold a referendum to get approval or abandon the idea altogether. If less than 10% of eligible voters submit the form, the project is allowed to go ahead. Nanaimo's used AAPs in the past. For example, in 2018, they used the process to get permission to borrow up to $17 million to reconstruct the fire hall downtown. In 2008, an alternative approval process failed to get approval to extend the city's urban containment boundary to include a portion of the lands at Cable Bay. At the time, more than 7,900 people submitted a form in opposition. Right now, there's an AAP underway in Ladysmith, which is looking for permission to borrow $13.5 million to build a new city hall. Back to Nanaimo and why the AAP is a subject for discussion this week. The city is looking to upgrade its public works yard, the place it services vehicles like plows and fire trucks. To do that, Council is planning to borrow up to $48.5 million. To try and get that permission, the city has run two AAP processes, both of which were abandoned after a resident raised concerns that the process hadn't been followed correctly. This led to a third-party review. Here's City of Nanaimo CAO Dale Lindsay speaking at this week's meeting.
The committee will certainly be aware that earlier this year we had the second of two failed or cancelled AAP processes that were both related to the public works, proposed building at Public Works. Following those cancelled processes, I felt it was important that we conduct a third-party peer review. I thought not only do we owe it to council, but also to the community to make sure that we better understand going forward where mistakes were made and in the future, so we can have the confidence of council and the community to conduct any future AAPs that are necessary.
Performing that review was Lisa Zworn, a lawyer and instructor at the School of Public Administration at Capilano University. The first AAP process ran for its full duration. There were just over 3,000 valid response forms submitted in opposition to the borrowing, which was below the threshold of just under 7,900 that would have been needed for the process not to succeed. But there was an issue. A letter from a resident received by the city of Nanaimo November 15th raised concerns about the process, including around the requirements about the notice given to the public. Here's Lisa Zworn explaining at Wednesday's meeting.
Some citizens raised concern about the way in which the notices were published and also had concerns about that they had not been made aware of the AAP process. In light of those concerns and reading through it, trying to figure out what the concern was, staff sought a legal opinion from law firm number one. That legal opinion indicated that there was merit to those concerns and that there could be a challenge to the validity of the process. Rather than risk a challenge, staff advised council of the situation, and the decision was made to stop AAP number 1 and proceed from there with the second AAP.
Zworn said that when planning the second AAP, the city sought legal advice, and the advice suggested the process they'd used to carry out the first AAP may have been defensible.
Subsequently, during AAP number 2, staff sought a legal opinion from law firm number 1 for another AAP, which used the same method of publishing with the same timing as was used for AAP number 1. Law firm number 1 stated, well, that way that was used was defensible. Well, when that occurred, staff went and sought another legal opinion from law firm number 2, which came to a similar conclusion that the way it was used was defensible. However, because AAP number 1 had been abandoned, the city could not revive AAP number 1 while it was dealing with everything for AAP number 2. That was not an option that was open.
Zworn said that at the time, she would have followed the same course of action as staff.
With regards for AAP 1, in light of the situation, the questions being raised, if you asked me what staff did, and if I had been your staff person, I would have done the same thing your staff did. Seek a legal opinion and follow the advice I was given, in spite of any later legal opinions. Your staff didn't want to risk it at the time based on the value of the project, the importance of the project to the community, and the public discourse that was happening at that time. At that point, it's easier to start the process again than sit on pins and needles wondering, is this going to be challenged or not? In the knowledge and experience of the lawyer providing that initial opinion would not cause me to question what they were saying. I would not be pushing back saying, well, what about? That's like your staff. I wouldn't have done that.
The second AAP was cancelled partway through. According to Zworn's report, a resident of Nanaimo raised concerns via email to the city. Among the concerns was that the elector response form was not made available until after public notice of the AAP was given. Here's Zworn speaking about the second AAP.
Now that takes me to AAP number 2. And I guess to say if something was going to go wrong, it did. It must have been the month of December, because at times it must have felt like a snowball rolling down a hill, getting bigger and bigger each time you turned around. There were several issues or concerns that arose during this process. Due to staffing issues, there was no senior staff member specifically overseeing the conduct of the AAP during the month of December. This is during the time when the preparation was happening. Unfortunately, the corporate officer was not there for several weeks due to personal matters. Your former deputy corporate officer, who retired in July and hadn't been involved with AAP number 1, wasn't familiar with what had happened there and was not there providing supervision over the staff. The person was there to work on special projects and to assist with the general operations of council, in particular dealing with meetings. The person conducting the preparation of AAP didn't have sufficient experience to work on the AAP alone. Plus, this person was also trying to do the work of getting things done for the council meetings and the agendas, which can be time-consuming. It's December. You may not have everybody there, and indeed that quite often happens at that time. Part of what was done in an effort to try to stem potential complaints that had arisen in the previous AAP, 2 notices were published. January 10th was being seen as a courtesy notice, while January 17th was being seen as the date of the official notice. However, it's important to know that the elector response forms were not available on either dates. And this makes a difference because, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have that electoral response form ready on the first day, not on the last day with that. The thing is, in fairness, the dates for AAP2 were prepared by staff and they were reviewed by the law firm number 1. At that time, the focus was on the dates that notices were being published and the start time of that 30-day time period. in which the electoral response forms were there. Everybody missed the start date for the electoral response forms. There was also some concerns, which makes it rather difficult, is that the behavior exhibited by some members of the public did not make things easier for staff, and it's hard to focus in on the work. Absolutely, the public is entitled to participate in this process, but the manner in which they were participating certainly added to the tension that was going with that. I liken it to when you're driving a car and you're too busy watching everything that's going on the side of the road, you lose focus and you don't see the car in front of you. And that, in essence, is a way of saying that's what happened. The deadlines were missed, or key dates were missed. In fairness, one person shouldn't have been working on this AAP by themselves, given that this was a AAP trying to fix the problems that happened, the first one, and trying to do more than was anticipated, and try to, take another step to try to address the concerns meant the key requirements that should have been met were missed.
Lisa Zworn speaking at a Wednesday Governance and Priorities Committee meeting in Nanaimo. Zworn conducted a third-party review of the city's 2 cancelled AAP processes.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Today on the show, we're focusing on a review into the city's 2 cancelled alternative approval processes, or AAPs. The AAPs were being used to ask voters for permission to borrow up to $48.5 million for a project that included upgrades to Nanaimo's public works yard. After a resident raised concerns with the first process, the city sought legal advice and decided to repeat the process. The second AAP was cancelled partway through after a citizen brought an error with the process to the city's attention. At a Governance and Priorities Committee meeting this week, lawyer Lisa Zworn presented findings of a review into the 2 AAPs. Zworn also spoke about potential future uses of an AAP.
Whether or not to use an AAP again, this is my take on it. I recognize trust has been eroded, both externally and internally. Being shy of using this process again, I get that. It would not, third time, is it the charm? You hope so. But the thing I'd like to highlight is that if assent voting were cheap and convenient, there'd be no need for an alternative approval process. Assent votes are costly. They're the equivalent of what you pay for an election. They have heavy administrative tasks. If you think trying to do an AAP off the side of your desk is difficult, trying to do an assent vote off the assent voting off the side of your desk, you can't do it. You have to fully commit. It's not a situation where you can wait to have all potential AAP questions addressed by means of assent voting instead at the time of a general election. Anytime you have assent voting other than at the time of a general election, you get extremely low turnout. And moreover, assent voting provides more opportunity for people to challenge the process and more items that could be missed. So my thought is it may be uncomfortable, but I think if you take some steps, you can look to use AAP in the future, but that is for council to make that decision.
Zworn also shared suggestions around communication for a potential future AAP.
I would anticipate that there are going to be challenges to the validity of the next AAP process that's used, irrespective of whatever the subject matter is. So I would suggest the city would want to take steps ahead of time. Part of that is just getting the information out ahead of time as to why the subject matter of the AAP is critical for the city and its operations. The reality is legislation doesn't require that you have a communications plan that goes out there, but the fact is there's a very real possibility of misinformation circulating about unless the city takes steps to say, not say you should vote for this or, you shouldn't sign the form, but to say this is what the purpose of the project is. It's not a situation where you can go to knock on every door in the community during that 30-day time period and talk to everybody with that. I know one citizen had suggested that there should be a letter sent to every resident along with an electoral response form. Given the costs, the potential for somebody to say, well, that's the official notice you gave me, it's concerning. I mean, that would be a lot of additional steps that don't keep it simple. I would suggest you want 2 communication plans, that being said, for one's the subject matter and the other is for the AAP. Now, your organization had a plan set out in AAP number 1 and modified it for AAP number 2. I would suggest you want to continue with that. It's a good way of looking at how do we get the message out there. As for the AAP plan, you may want to consider doing the following things to help provide further information for citizens to make up their minds. If you receive an inquiry from a single citizen, summarize the content of it so it can't be traced back to the person who made it, but post that response to the inquiry on the website. Chances are someone else may have it. You've got some really good frequently asked questions. You can add more to it. There were questions that were asked this past one, like can we extend the time frame and that? Put those responses in there and keep that on a steady basis. You've got a wonderful basic AAP website that says, or page that says, here's the process. And then you also have the information for the very specific AAP. That works great. Another thing is someone said, well, I'm going to make a Freedom of Information request to get the information I want. Go for it. But also I would suggest is proactively disclose the response for the Freedom of Information. Chances are if somebody wants that information, they would benefit from seeing that as well. A local government can choose to proactively disclose.
Zworn also suggested council consider asking the province for changes to the legislation that sets out the rules for AAPs.
It's worth approaching the province to ask for some changes to the legislation in this regard to provide more clarity of exactly what needs to be done when. For example, just the confusion with regards for the notice, maybe asking that, despite the requirements of Section 94.2, subsection 5, subsection V, here's the following that will reply. 2 notices published on the day constitutes 2 separate notices, and the electoral response must be made available on that day. There's some other points with that, but a bit more clarity from the ministry may assist both you and other local governments going forward. As a wrap-up, as I said, I understand there is a potential court case coming forward, which may take all my recommendations, and because of how the interpretation came out, it may not be suitable going forward. But until that case has occurred, those would be my recommendations to council.
Sandy Bartlett is a lawyer who's been critical of the AAP process. Speaking as a delegation at the council meeting, he said that a court case in the Capital Regional District dealing with issues related to the rules around alternative approval processes will have a hearing on September 3rd.
I'm the lawyer on the case that is before the Supreme Court in Victoria. It's with respect to a bylaw of the Capital Regional District. And in that case, it's going to be about the central issues that were in AP number 1 in Nanaimo.
Bartlett said during the meeting that he would like to see the process last for 90 days rather than the minimum 30 required by legislation. Councillors also looked to set out the number of response forms that an individual would be able to pick up from City Hall during the process. Going into the meeting, staff had suggested a limit of 100 per person per day. The form is also available online to print off. Councillor Tyler Brown said staff were unfairly treated by members of the public during the last process.
With respect to the forms, in general, I agree with Councillor Thorpe's comments that we should send this back to staff to craft something and just be not overly prescriptive. But just due to the exclusion and how this unfolded, I think it would be appropriate for the GPC to provide that clarity for staff and just take ownership over that, especially because it became such a lightning rod and staff were very unfairly treated by certain members of the public on that. Be very clear, nothing, I was present in the lobby for some of those interactions, just sitting in a chair and seeing them go down. I'll be nice, but they were shameful and ridiculous. And I agree with Mr. Bartlett to a certain degree that most part folks have some good faith around intentions and not necessarily always in agreement with the process or the outcomes of both staff or council. But I also can point out, even in this very meeting, there's a sign that's suggestive that council is knowingly or unknowingly committing treason. That's not necessarily a widespread belief, but I do think it is evidence that the good faith is not shared by everyone. And some of that toxicity definitely spilled out through this process. And I think, council's one thing, elected to take that, but staff are just showing up to do their job and their work and not deserving of any of that. So I think that number should be set, and I think it should be set at 20 forms per person for the entire duration. I think 100 is pandering to the worst part of that process.
Nanaimo Mayor Leonard Krogh outlined his position on the issue.
I am basing my position on this simply. It is a process to enable a reasonable portion of the voters in a community to express their opposition to a decision that council has made. We don't put these things out because we want people to oppose the project. We put it forward because as council we have decided in our wisdom with the advice of staff and exercising the responsibility the electorate gives us to bring forward the proposition that we borrow money for a specific project. One has to assume that council supports it. We don't throw these things out willy-nilly. So this is an opportunity for the voters to say, we happen to disagree with your judgment, even though we elected you to exercise that judgment and act responsibly and listen to staff and read reports and pay attention to things. So having said that, extending it to 90 days, as Mr. Bartlett suggested, I think is preposterous, with great respect. What's the length of an election period, federal, provincial, or municipal? How much time does one need? And if a sufficient number of signatures are obtained in opposition, then we are stuck with a referendum, and council may well be mortally embarrassed by it, but that's okay. But my understanding is, from Ms. Gurry's response tonight, we didn't even come near the number of signatures that were required that would have actually been accessible. And that was in 2 processes, and surely the media coverage and everything involved in it would indicate that, in fact, the majority of the citizens of Nanaimo either didn't care or trusted council or indeed supported a long-standing project, the arguments for which I will not repeat tonight, which we have heard articulated by Mr. Sims and Mr. Rosen and various other individuals before us on many times, including reports. So, for what it's worth, I look forward to a policy. I am not in favor of 100 forms per day per person. I think if you're responsible and you take your citizenship seriously and you think it's worth opposing this, then print off your own form or come and sit to City Hall and pick it up and hand it in. But don't pretend that this is some minor exercise. When we're talking about the safety of our workers, the ability for our equipment and our workers to be safe and our equipment to withstand a major catastrophic event when the citizens will be relying on those workers and the equipment available, I think it's something that needs to be taken seriously. I emphasize my remarks around this particular process only, but there will be other processes as well.
Council directed staff to come back to a future Governance and Priorities Committee meeting with a policy including that the number of forms someone can pick up be set at 10. They also unanimously voted to direct staff to prepare a resolution for submission to the Union of BC Municipalities Annual Convention, outlining issues around the clarity and process of the legislation that governs the alternative approval process. Also passing unanimously was a motion from Councillor Hilary Eastmere that the city send a letter to the province requesting amendments to the applicable legislation pertaining to the AAP to remove the issues that have arisen. Options to fund the city's planned upgrades to its public works yard are on the agenda for a June 24th Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.